Welcome to Poker Market, making poker more efficient.
What's up guys, this is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Welcome to part 6 of this fundamental theorem series. Today we're going to be talking about protection betting. Right from the outset of this series we were mentioned that there were certain types of bets which didn't fall accurately into the category of either value bet or bluff or semi-bluff. And we're going to refer to these bets as protection bets. We'll also go on to see throughout this episode that there is more than one type of protection bet, and even the term protection bet is a somewhat rather vague description for a reason for betting which doesn't coincide very well for one of the main reasons for betting, which is either value betting or bluffing. So coming up in this episode, basic components of a protection bet. We're going to talk about shutting down strategy options. We'll see what we mean by this shortly. And we're going to have a look at a range versus range example where we use a solver to demonstrate that small bet sizings will make sense in certain scenarios. So let's start by talking about protection bets. We mentioned there is more than one type of protection bet. We're going to start with the really basic version of protection bet. And essentially by protection we're talking about protection from equity. There's other things that we need to protect against, as we'll go on to see. But the general basic idea when discussing protection bets is that we are protecting against an equity share that our opponent has. Very often the equity share won't necessarily be a favorite against us, because let's say our opponent has a hand that's going to be a favorite against us. He's very often not going to be folding that hand, although it's not always going to be the case. We're talking specifically about equity that our opponent has with some of the weaker hands in his range, hands which can still go on to outdraw us, but by betting we can actually elicit folds. Now in some senses this plays around a misconception. One of the first things that we maybe are taught as poker players is that generally when we bet, the reasons are that we either want to get called by worse, have 50% equity against our opponent's calling range, or we want to fold out a better hand. Well, the idea of protection bets is we think that we have the best hand, but we want to fold out worse hands, and so we bet. This is even applicable in situations where, by betting, we actually isolate ourselves against a range that has us beat. And once again, we may think that this is completely contrary to the basic idea of value betting, which is you have to be a favorite against your opponent's calling range. If you're not a favorite against his calling range, then you shouldn't bet. Well, according to this definition of protection bet, there are situations where we think we have the best hand, we think we're going to be behind our opponent's calling range, but we should bet anyway. Why do we still bet? Because we fold out a considerable equity share. We're also going to see later that we may potentially shut down strategic options from our opponent, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about protection bets. Now, in some senses, the most similar type of bet to a protection bet is the semi-bluff. The reason is that semi-bluffs have two components. They have an equity component and they have a fold equity component. The same thing is true with protection bets. They have an equity component and a fold equity component. The interesting thing is we often don't mind too much which is the main component, and this is in some senses similar to semi-bluffs. There are types of semi-bluffs where we have a bunch of fold equity but very little pot equity when called. There are other types of semi-bluffs where we don't really rate our fold equity too highly, but we're going to have a bunch of pot equity when called, so we just don't really mind too much if our opponent doesn't really fold. Now as a rough guide, we're generally going to make a protection bet in situations where we think we have the best equity. So when we think about the equity component of a protection bet, in a sense there are two equity components. There is the equity component before we bet, and there is the equity component after we bet and we get called. Now the way protection bets work is, in most cases, we're not going to be making protection bets in a situation where we expect a hand to be an underdog. Usually it's going to be better to check. As we're going to go on to demonstrate, there are actually a bunch of exploitative exceptions to this rule. So we're going to have a look at some situations where actually we're an underdog, but we should still protection bet. So once again, this might seem very counterintuitive because on a very basic level, it would mean we are investing chips into the pot in a situation where our opponent has the best hand. But sometimes in poker we're going to be in a situation where we have to make a choice between two losing options. And our essential goal is simply to pick the least losingest line. Now we've already seen an example of this when we talked about value betting. In a situation where we're out of position on the river, we make a value bet, we expect to be a dog against our opponent's calling range, but we still do that because we know that if we check, an astute opponent's going to be able to effectively lower our expectation by turning our hand into a bluff catcher after we check. So it may actually be better for us to fire a bet ourselves. We're picking between two losing options. And so it can be the case with protection bets in scenarios where we're going to be a slight underdog. And once again, the more of a dog you become, the less likely it is you're going to be protection betting. There's some kind of correlation there. But it's very conceivable you're in a scenario where maybe you have 45% equity against your opponent's range with your specific holding, and it's still correct to put a protection bet out there. There's at least two parameters which can cause that protection bet to be correct, despite the fact they're essentially investing money as a dog.